Good morning. Question: why are there so many inmates in the Wayne County Jail committing suicide? And what's being done about it? More than in Chicago and in the city of New York. Action News reporter Ross Jones is here today to shed more light on this growing problem that is costing you, the taxpayers, a mint. And later, historian and urban America expert Thomas Segru looks back at Detroit in 1967 and Detroit today. It's Sunday, July the 30th. I'm Chuck Stokes, and this is Spotlight. My colleague Ross Jones, investigative reporter here at Action News, needs no introduction to the audience out there. Welcome.
Good morning, sir.
You did an eye-opening investigation about the suicide deaths at the Wayne County Jail. In Macomb, since April of last year, only 1, 0 in Oakland County, and 8 in Wayne County. Is that just a freak situation or a pattern here?
Well, it certainly is a pattern. Whether or not it's something that's emblematic of a larger problem is the bigger question. You mentioned Oakland and Macomb County. We looked at much bigger jails too, because 8 really jumps off the page, not just in Michigan, but nationwide. Cook County in Illinois, a jail that's about 5 or 6 times the size of Wayne County.
Whole lot bigger. Yeah.
0 suicides during the same period. New York City Department of Corrections, 10,000 inmates, about 10 times the size of Wayne County, 0 suicides.
So what's going on here?
Well, it's a number of different things. I mean, Wayne County jails, as you've covered, have been crumbling for a long time.
Yeah.
One of the jails is almost 100 years old. So part of the problem is the infrastructure is really outdated, and there's just a lot of old pipes and old bars and things that lend themselves to people who want to hang themselves if they want to. And it's difficult to retrofit the whole jail. The other problem is, as we've reported, there's a huge understaffing problem. They have a very hard time getting deputies to A, come apply for jobs, and B, to stay, because the pay is so low, the conditions are so awful. They're about 200 deputies short, so they don't have enough guys to patrol the jails. And the guys,
which has been an ongoing problem. We've heard Sheriff Napoleon talk about it. We've heard the representatives for the unions talk about it.
For sure. And even when they do hire guys, they don't stay for very long. Sometimes they might stay for just 6 months, 12 months. They got to hire new guys, retrain them again. And it's difficult to retain that kind of knowledge and develop that institutional knowledge when you're only there for less than a year. And
sort of a sidebar to this, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Wayne County staff workers don't make as much as if you work in Oakland and Macomb.
Pretty much anywhere, really.
You may go in there and get hired off to somewhere else for more money.
Exactly. No, you're making about $31,000 a year to work in a building that, again, is about 100 years old, often doesn't have air conditioning. You're working with some of the most dangerous accused criminals in the state. So you can understand why a lot of folks don't want to apply for those jobs.
There are people that are concerned about this. Judge Kinney, who's sort of overseeing the consent decree, I guess, on all of this, he's concerned about it. You talk to law professor up at the University of Michigan. She says this seems to be high compared to the rest of the country as well. How much of it do you think is sort of policy, procedure, training? And you point out the incident about the belts. Yeah. And you guys noticed while you were there that someone was walking around with a belt, and you aren't supposed to have belts.
Exactly. So one of these suicides took place in jail intake, where a guy was coming through. He had just gotten to jail. It's kind of like the introductory process to the Wayne County Jail. He had a belt on. He was in a private cell. He used it to hang himself. So we were told during our interview, after that incident, we took belts away from everybody. Nobody has a belt when they go through intake. And during the tour, my photographer and I, we weren't allowed to take pictures, but we were taking notes, and we saw a guy go through intake, keep his belt on, and keep going. So the big question here is they have all these...
And that seems to be training and following procedures. If you have procedures.
If they have procedures, are they being followed? And we saw in a very short tour that a pretty big procedure obviously wasn't being followed. So to answer your question, I think it's a lot of different things, but obviously there's got to be follow-through here. They can't just say all the right things. They need to do all the right things. And in a few of the cases we looked at here, there was some evidence to suggest they weren't always doing what they were supposed to be doing.
There'll be people out there who will say, why do we really care that much? Sure. These are inmates. They did something wrong or have been accused of doing something wrong, waiting to have their day in court. Many of them are repeat and violent offenders. So so be it. Is there that sort of attitude that maybe is making people not address this in a way that it should be addressed?
No doubt at all. And even when we, when talking to some folks on Facebook, I heard that sentiment from a lot of people, and I understand it. Here's a couple of points I would make. First of all, we've done a number of stories, more recently, it seems, about a lot of people who have been in jail and in prison for things that we find out years later they didn't actually do. Even though the evidence pointed to them, turns out we got the wrong person. So there's that. The other issue is whether you care about this population or not. Every time there's a death in the jail, whether it's a suicide or anything else, there's an investigation to determine whether or not all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. And if there's any evidence that the county didn't do what it's supposed to keep inmates safe.
Here come the lawsuits.
Here come the lawsuits. And Wayne County has paid out in just 4 suicides from the last few years more than $1 million. And $1 million could go a very long way in that jail that is literally falling apart right now.
And that is, as everybody says, is understaffed.
Absolutely.
There's all this talk about a new jail. We don't know exactly when it will be built. Certainly has been a big major controversy. That should help when and if it ever gets up and operating. And
it's got to come at some point, but is that going to be 2 years, 3 years down the road? Nobody knows. But yes, there's no question. Everybody agrees that if and when that jail opens up, it's going to be more modernized. It's going to be a lot better. It's going to be retrofitted to this type of population that is at a greater risk for suicide. So that's going to help a lot. But again, if you're still 200 deputies short, if the deputies you have aren't following the policies that are in place to protect this population, what good is that really going to do?
You mentioned the lawsuits. You interviewed the lady Sally Schultz, whose son, Billy Schultz, committed suicide, used his socks when he was at the Wayne County Jail. She's now hired a lawyer.
She has hired a lawyer, and there is some evidence to suggest here, obviously, that the jail didn't do what it was supposed to do here. But, these cases are very costly and they're very depressing. And in the case of Mr. Schultz here, he was a mental health patient. He was there because he was struggling with some mental health issues, and he was wearing a paper gown because they knew he was at a greater risk of suicide. So the question is, why would you give somebody a paper gown that makes it harder to hang themselves, but not take their socks, which he then used to take his life? So there's just all these red flags that would suggest that there's a bigger problem here at the jail.
All right, we're going to take a break. You teased what I want to talk about next: mental health and the role that it plays here and in other places of our society. We'll be right back with investigative reporter Ross Jones. And welcome back to Spotlight. I remember Sheriff Benny Napoleon, Wayne County, sitting where you're sitting 2-3 years ago, and he was talking about the jails, and he said our biggest problem are the number of inmates that are suffering from mental health, and it's not being addressed. I think his figure at that time, don't hold me to it, I think it was around 65%, he said. I've since heard Chief James Craig from the Detroit Police Department say to you in one of your reports, he thinks it's closer to like 70%. That's enormous.
It's enormous.
You've done several reports about our mental health system. Are we not addressing that, and how much is this playing into all of that?
It's absolutely no. We're not addressing it as a state, as a country. We could do stories every day in our newscast about people who are just being failed routinely by the system that we have in place. So no, that's a huge part of this. And essentially the jails have become mental hospitals, and very few people in the jail are trained to treat this population and to treat them well.
No, they're trained in corrections, not in mental health.
Exactly. So, I mean, is it a surprise that things like this are happening? No. But I mean, 3 of the individuals who took their lives here were mental health patients. Frankly, I'm surprised the number's not even higher.
Yeah. I think back to the situation with the officer with Wayne State University. Very, very tragic situation, and the gentleman who was arrested for that, Mr. Pryor, signs that he suffered from mental health, and Chief James Craig upset with that, and that perhaps more could be done, and if it had been addressed, then maybe we would not have lost a life there.
He had had a number of interactions, not just with police, but he had gone to hospitals. His family had petitioned for him to get some sort of treatment, and he did get some treatment, but obviously it wasn't enough. And the biggest problem, the one thread that we see in all the stories that we do, is when you go into the hospital, whether it be for a short stay or a long stay, once you leave the door, once you walk out and you're off to take care of yourself, supposedly, there's no follow-up. There's almost never any follow-up to make sure you are staying well. And oftentimes we see cases like with the Wayne State officer, months, years down the road, that same person who we was in the system, we were trying to get him on the right track, obviously went back off the track. And you know, there's just so many opportunities here that are missed in the state's mental health system.
Obviously, this is all about money, money that the state oftentimes says we don't have it. You know, there's not enough money in our budgets to be able to adequately address it. Is it just about money, or is it more than that?
Well, I think money is the biggest thing. I mean, there's no question keeping the state hospitals open, for example, is a huge, huge cost to the state. But also, and not to the same degree as with inmates, but this is a population that isn't really able to advocate for itself as well as others with interest groups. And I think that there is still certainly a stigma associated with mental illness, and it's not an issue that a lot of people care as much about until these horrific incidents happen. And even then, only for about as long as it's in the news. So to galvanize support, to really make some sort of meaningful change, has obviously been a very difficult battle.
Well, certainly I've heard Tom Watkins sit there. He talked about it when he was over at Detroit Mental Health Authority. He's now moving on to probably greater pastures, but he has been advocating on this issue for a long period of time. All right, very quickly, former Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick has requested once again, put together information that he submitted that his sentence should be vacated. Yeah. What's happening with that?
Well, he's got 24 years left on his sentence. He's got nothing but time, so I guess you can't.
That's a lot of time.
You can understand why he's making all these arguments, even though they've got about a chance this size of being successful. Essentially, he's saying that his lawyer, Jim Thomas, who represented him throughout the trial, had a conflict. He was really working on behalf of someone else who was involved in the trial. That was a point he brought up earlier that the judge dismissed. He also said they just had a bad relationship. It broke down, and at one point on the eve of trial, he said he tried to assault his lawyer. He chased him around a conference table. Things had gotten that bad. So if you can just imagine what that would have looked like.
Yeah, there are times when you wish you had a camera and we just didn't have one.
So if it happened, he's claiming that that's a reason that he should get a new trial, vacate his sentence. It's a long shot, but again, he's got nothing to lose.
All right. We'll see what happens. I'm sure that will not be the end of that story.
I'm sure not.
Ross Jones, thanks for coming in.
Thank you,
Always
sir.
a pleasure. Keep up the good reporting. And when we come back, I'll sit down with New York University historian, former native Detroiter, Tom Segru. We'll be right back. Earlier this week, I sat down with Detroit native and noted New York University historian Thomas Segru at the Detroit Historical Museum. I wanted to get his thoughts on what happened here 50 years ago and what it means to America today. You're back here 50 years after 1967. You've gotten a lot of attention from the book Detroit 1967. How did you get involved in that project?
I got involved in the project because I've been thinking about and writing about and teaching about Detroit for most of my adult lifetime. I'm a native Detroiter. I was an eyewitness as a 5-year-old child to what happened in 1967.
East Sider, right?
West Sider.
West Sider. Okay.
I have vivid recollections from my 5th birthday of watching National Guard vehicles, personnel carriers, and armored trucks rolling down Fenkell Avenue, right a half block from my parents' home. So I've been thinking about this for a long time.
Professor, your thoughts on that age-old debate? Was it a riot, a rebellion, or insurrection? What are you comfortable with?
I think the best term is rebellion or uprising. That is, most of the people who took to the streets in Detroit and other cities in 1967 saw themselves as challenging on some level, not necessarily deeply theorized or thought out, but challenging on some level exploitation, dehumanization, predation by shopkeepers and by the police, primarily, the most visible agents of white America in African American neighborhoods in the city. There were differences between Detroit and the South, for sure. There weren't signs at drinking fountains and at lunch counters that restricted African Americans and whites from being together, but It was a city of fairly complete racial separation.
This book is a compilation of a lot of different essays. Why is it important for people to sit down and digest it?
I think it's important to hear the voices of people who have different orientations towards what happened. I think it's important to look at some of the essays go all the way back to slavery in the 19th century and remind us that the problem of racial injustice is not just a problem down there in the South. It was a problem. We had slavery in Detroit. We had racial injustice and racial segregation in Detroit. And also some of the voices captured the immediacy of what was going on in 1967, the confusion, the anger, sometimes the excitement of what was happening on the city streets. And so it's really important to see an event from as many different vantage points, historical and contemporary, as possible.
In 1967, was the police department totally unprepared for what happened, and were they completely insensitive to what was happening in the African American community?
95% or so of the Detroit police force in 1967 was white. Most white police officers had interactions with African Americans only in the setting of patrolling in black neighborhoods. They mostly didn't have black neighbors. They mostly didn't have black friends. They certainly weren't drinking with black folks in bars, playing baseball with them, or having them as members of their families. There was an enormous chasm of distrust. And that played out in the kinds of tactics that police deployed on the streets of the city, viewing most African Americans, even women in their church finest, going to church on Sunday, as potential threats, as potential criminals, as folks that needed to be disciplined. 1967, politically, socially, was one of the most intense and tumultuous years in modern American history. I mean, maybe second only to 1968 in terms of disorder, protest. It was a moment when there was no center, when politics was up for grabs, when Lyndon Johnson was unpopular because of the Vietnam War and because of discontent in the streets, where he was facing challengers, including Michigan Governor George Romney, where African Americans were saying civil rights is going too slow, too fast, when leftists and religious activists are protesting what they see as the injustice of a war in Vietnam, when the Reverend King, Martin Luther King Jr., is becoming increasingly radical in his criticism of inequality and war in the United States. And so we're in a really, it's a cauldron of protest and discontent. And what happens in Detroit in the summer of 1967 has to be understood in that national, even international context.
When Spotlight returns, Thomas Segru on Detroit in 2017. We'll be right back. What lessons have we learned from 1967 that should apply today?
The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Talked about riots as being the language of the unheard. I think the most important lesson from 67 is stuff is going to blow up. People are going to get angry if they're not heard. And so many of the questions of racial injustice in the United States are unheard. We don't listen. And that means policymakers, that means politicians, that means corporate leaders, that means ordinary Americans. We need to listen. If we don't, then folks are at some point going to express their frustrations in ways that will make it sure that they're heard, even if it's a message that a lot don't want to hear.
Do you see any similarities between the policies and politics and even immigration today compared to 1967?
I think looking at Ferguson, St. Louis, Charleston, Minneapolis, Baltimore, New York City, and I could give you a litany of names, looking at the ways in which there's still 50 years after the 1960s, after the civil rights struggle, after the Detroit Rebellion, 50 years after, there's still intense suspicions, hostilities, and collisions, and harassment and brutality on the part of law enforcement officials. That's a depressing commonality between 1967 and 2017. The immigration issue is a big one, but 2017 is a big one. 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 there's extensive research by scholars pretty much from across the political spectrum that shows that immigration is a net positive for American cities. It reinvigorates their economies. It leads to declines in crime. The idea that putting up a wall or driving out folks because they don't look or talk like ordinary Americans, native-born white Americans, is a serious problem, and it portends greater conflict. Some of the most ugly incidents in American history in the 1890s, in the 1920s, again during the Second World War, were prompted by animus, alienation toward outsiders, towards supposed foreigners, people who are un-American. And that's a past that we ought to be really, really careful to remember and to try not to relive.
Detroit's your original hometown. You're back here 50 years later. Your thoughts about where Detroit is today and where we may be headed?
Detroit is being branded the comeback city by so many outside observers, and there's a lot of investment and more going on, especially in the downtown and midtown areas, than one could have imagined a decade ago. But we need to think about the rest of the city.
The neighborhoods.
The neighborhoods, right? We can't make the assumption that downtown gentrification and revitalization is going to trickle down and benefit the mostly working class and poorer residents of most of the city's 139 square miles. And thinking about a city coming back, we have to think about who is it coming back for? Is it coming back for hipsters and empty nesters and tourists with lots of disposable income? Or is it coming back to the hardworking people who are struggling to make ends meet, folks who are clinging on to their houses trying to get by? And ultimately we have to think about them first, I think, in deciding whether or not Detroit's really come back.
You'll be meeting with Mayor Duggan while you're here. Will that be part of your advice to him? He's
made moves towards putting an emphasis on neighborhoods and on community development in neighborhoods, but that needs a lot of reinforcement, I think, because there's a lot of bang to showing off revitalized downtown for any big city mayor or any politician, a lot less bang for showing some new stores opening up in a working class neighborhood or some houses being renovated. And I think we need to really put an emphasis on the latter.
Thank you for sitting down with us here at the Detroit Historical Museum. Thomas Sugrue, a man that certainly makes you think. From 12th and Claremont, I'm Chuck Stokes. We'll be back next week with more newsmakers in the spotlight. We hope you have a great week.